Just days before his demise, Edgar Allan Poe was discovered wandering aimlessly in the streets in a dissociative state. Disturbingly, he was wearing clothes that did not belong to him, and in his dying moments, he repeatedly uttered a single word. Edgar Allan Poe makes most tragic artists seem quite well-adjusted in comparison. The master of the macabre lived a life saturated with scandal, tragedy, and addiction, yet his mysterious death surpassed them all. Before he became Edgar Allan Poe, he was simply Edgar Poe, the second child of two actors, born in Boston, Massachusetts. Had circumstances unfolded as planned, young Edgar might have followed his parents into a life on stage. However, fate intervened. Unsurprisingly, the life of the infamously dark and melancholic writer commenced in a somber and bleak manner. There is a strong likelihood that Poe was named after a character in Shakespeare's King Lear, a play his parents were performing around the time of his birth. If this is indeed the case, it is fitting, as Edgar Allan Poe's life story was undeniably a tragedy. A mere year after Poe's birth, his father deserted the family. Then a year following that, consumption claimed his mother. If you are hoping that his father stepped in and returned to support his orphaned children, you are destined for disappointment. The exact circumstances of his father's death remain unknown, but Poe's father passed away in the same year as his mother. Young Edgar Poe and his older brother were left utterly alone in the world. However, Poe received assistance from an entirely unexpected source. Taking pity on the young boy, a wealthy merchant named John Allan took Edgar into his home in Richmond, Virginia. Allan provided Poe with a place to live, a semblance of family he had never known, and a name. But while John Allan took in the young boy, life in the Allan household was far from idyllic. It could be incredibly challenging. Edgar Allan Poe had an exceptionally complex relationship with his foster father. While Allan could sometimes be lavishly generous towards Poe, he also possessed a darker side. Whenever Poe transgressed, Allan's discipline was swift and severe. Their volatile relationship was undoubtedly stressful, though his later life would be characterized by poverty, addiction, and mental instability. Edgar Allan Poe enjoyed a relatively privileged childhood. He relocated to England with the Allans at the age of 6 and received a superior education at prestigious boarding schools across the country. Perhaps if the Allans had remained in England, Poe might have been spared the life of suffering that awaited him, but we will never know. In 1820, the Allans set sail for America once more, completely oblivious to what lay ahead. The Allans were already affluent, but in 1825, they struck gold. Like many wealthy individuals, John Allan had an even wealthier uncle, and upon his death, he bequeathed his nephew a substantial inheritance in both cash and property. John Allan's inheritance would be equivalent to approximately $17 million today. That is a considerable sum, and Allan celebrated the occasion in a manner most would. He purchased a house, but not just any house. Allan acquired a sprawling two-story brick manor. Shortly thereafter, Poe encountered the love of his life, Sarah Elmira Royster, who resided next door. When Poe was 16 and Royster was 15, the two neighbors transformed their relationship into something more profound. However, sadly, their love was doomed from the outset. Shortly after Poe proposed to Royster, he enrolled at the University of Virginia. They were separated, but Poe diligently sent love letters to his fiancée as frequently as possible. There was only one problem. Royster's father ensured she never received a single one. He intercepted and destroyed every letter Poe dispatched. Heartbroken, Royster assumed Poe had forgotten her. By the time Poe next saw her, she was already married to another man. Losing Sarah was a devastating blow for Poe, but at least he had ample distractions to divert his mind. He was studying at the University of Virginia. Poe lost his first love, but he discovered another while away at school: gambling. Before long, he was deeply indebted to various dubious characters. As you can imagine, this did not exactly impress his foster father, who was, incidentally, funding Poe's education. Their relationship had always been somewhat strained, but as Poe descended further into disarray, his foster father began to lose patience. If you were to believe Poe, he was the victim in this situation. He asserted that Allan kept him on a meager allowance and that he lacked sufficient funds for classes, textbooks, and lodging. Of course, he neglected to mention all the money he had squandered on all-night gambling sprees. Against his better judgment, Allan ultimately sent Poe more money, which Poe used to accumulate even more debt. After a year of drinking, gambling, and minimal academic engagement, Poe concluded that university was simply not for him. He dropped out, but his persistent pleas for money had severed his connection with the Allens. This, combined with the news that Sarah Royster had married another man, convinced Poe he could not return to Richmond. Poe decided to return to his birthplace. In April 1827, Poe resolved to forge a life for himself in Boston. He accepted whatever temporary jobs he could find, working as a clerk, writing for newspapers, or any other means to make ends meet. However, as you will soon learn, Poe was not adept at maintaining employment. He quickly found himself struggling and began to grow desperate. Boston did not unfold as Poe had envisioned, and before long he was completely penniless. With no other viable options, he enlisted in the army. Well, not exactly Edgar Poe, and Edgar A. Perry enlisted. Why the name change? Poe's application was not entirely legitimate. There was just one issue with Poe's plan to join the army and make something of himself. At just 18 years old, he was too young to enlist, but that was not about to deter someone as desperate as Poe. Edgar Allan Poe changed names as frequently as others changed garments, and he became the 22-year-old Edgar A. Perry. His plan succeeded, and he joined the army. In that same year, he published his first book, Tamerlane and Other Poems. It was a 40-page collection of poetry, and its enigmatic byline simply stated, "By a Bostonian." So did this avant-garde poetry book ignite the literary world and catapult Poe to overnight fame? Well, Poe's initial foray into the literary world proved to be an utter failure. He only managed to have 50 copies printed, and those 50 copies were essentially ignored. At least he had the army to fall back on. But if we have learned anything about Poe by this point, it is that he was not the most stable individual. He became restless. He suddenly desired to leave the army. And would you believe it, he had the perfect excuse. Remember how Poe had falsified his enlistment form? Fortunately for him, this provided an easy exit when he wished to leave the army. He simply revealed his real name and age to his commanding officer. He was certain he was scot-free, but nothing was ever that straightforward for Edgar Allan Poe. His commanding officer agreed to release him, but on one condition. Unfortunately, that one condition was virtually impossible. Poe's commanding officer informed Poe he would release him only if he reconciled with his foster father, John Allan. The problem was, Allan wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. Poe spent months sending letters to Allan, begging for forgiveness. Allan ignored every single one. That was bad enough, but it paled in comparison to Allan's ultimate betrayal. John Allan was so exasperated with his foster son that he did not even inform Poe that his wife and Poe's foster mother was on her deathbed. By the time Poe finally discovered the truth, it was too late. He arrived back in Richmond the day after her burial. But at least there was a silver lining to this otherwise tragic affair. Perhaps the loss of his wife softened his cold heart, because Allan finally buried the hatchet with his troubled foster son. With Allan's support, Poe secured his discharge from the army. It must have been bittersweet, but he was finally able to move forward with his life. And it appears that good fortune arrived in waves for Poe, because that was not the only piece of positive news he received around this time. Poe finally obtained the discharge he had sought, but the subsequent development was even better. The world-renowned critic John Neal had read his poetry, and he liked it. A positive mention from Neal was monumental in the nascent world of 19th century American literature. For the first time, Poe had reason to believe he might possess a talent for writing. Poe began to publicly criticize his foster father, and that was the final straw for Allan. The two had been at odds for nearly Poe's entire life, but this time Poe had gone too far. He permanently disowned Poe. Poe headed to New York to attempt to finally succeed as a writer. But before he could gain any momentum, a terrible tragedy struck at home. His elder brother was seriously ill. Poe put his ambitions on hold and returned to Baltimore to be with his brother, Henry. Poe, like his brother, had been a drinker, and it had caught up with him. He died on August 1st, 1831, at only 24 years old. After the loss of his brother, Poe decided it was time to cease making excuses and begin earning a living as a full-time writer. But that was easier said than done. You see, 19th century American publishing was an absolute nightmare for writers. Without any international copyright law, publishers could simply plagiarize British works and publish them for free. So why pay an American author? Poe would very quickly learn that his chosen profession was anything but lucrative, and it drove him to disturbing depths. Even if you managed to persuade a publisher to release your writing, they might simply refuse to pay you, As his career began to gain traction, the great Edgar Allan Poe often had to resort to begging his publishers for the money they had promised him. It was a miserable existence, and even when Poe achieved any modicum of success, he usually managed to sabotage it. So when Poe actually landed a position working as an editor at a literary magazine, it was almost inevitable that it would end disastrously. One of the stories Poe had managed to get published caught the attention of a wealthy patron who introduced Poe to the editor of the Southern Literary Messenger. Poe was hired as an assistant editor, and it finally appeared he was gaining a foothold in the literary world. But Poe's greatest obstacle was always Poe himself. Almost immediately, Poe's boss noticed he had a habit of arriving at work intoxicated. Poe did not last a month, but while his professional life was in ruins, at least he had women to distract him. Poe moved in with his aunt, uncle, and now 11-year-old cousin Virginia in 1835. He obtained a license to marry Virginia. He was 26 years old and she was 13. Even in 1835, marrying your 13-year-old cousin was a profoundly unsettling thing to do. Again, to emphasize that this was not normal, they had to fabricate and claim that Virginia was 21. Despite virtually everyone in the world finding it creepy at best and deeply disturbing at worst, Poe had finally done it. He had married his 13-year-old cousin, but the relationship was even more twisted than it appeared. Tragedy was about to rear its ugly head once again. One evening, Virginia Poe was singing and playing piano for Poe when she suffered a frightening episode. Poe later described it as breaking a blood vessel in her throat. Virginia had been the picture of health, so the couple likely assumed it was inconsequential. Sadly, it was a dark omen of things to come. Virginia never fully recovered from her attack that night. She became weak and frail, a mere shadow of her former self. Now, Poe was not the most stable person on his best days, but the sight of his wife wasting away was too much for him to endure. If he had enjoyed drink before, now it became like mother's milk to him. Poe lost himself to alcohol, and as you can imagine, it began to negatively impact other aspects of his life as well. The best way to thrive in the writing world is through connections, and that was not exactly Poe's forte. He made some very powerful enemies when he publicly accused the beloved Henry Wadsworth Longfellow of plagiarism. It seemed Poe could not take two steps without self-sabotaging in some manner. When Poe's poem, The Raven, appeared in the Evening Mirror, it was the equivalent of a viral sensation. The poem became an instant hit, and journals across the country clamored to publish it. Virtually overnight, households all across America came to know the name Edgar Allan Poe. After decades of struggle and failure, Poe had finally arrived. But remember how I mentioned the 19th century was not exactly kind to writers? Poe was about to learn that the hard way. Being a household name was not exactly everything. The Raven made Edgar Allan Poe a nationwide sensation, but just because he was famous did not mean he was wealthy. The Evening Mirror paid Poe a paltry $9 for the poem. He never saw another cent. When the poem became a hit, perhaps he thought his troubles were over, but in reality, they were only beginning. Virginia did not prevent Poe from looking at other women. In fact, she may have even encouraged it. That is how Poe began his tumultuous relationship with the poet Frances Sargent Osgood. To call it a mess would be an understatement. First, there was the fact that Osgood already had a husband. Next, there was Elizabeth F. Elliot, another poet who happened to be obsessed with Poe and who utterly despised Osgood. The notoriously petty and vindictive Elliot seemed to operate under the belief, if I cannot have him, no one can. Gossip columns across the country picked up the story and reprinted Elliot's accusations. Before long, half of the country believed Poe was a deranged adulterer. Granted, his erratic behavior did not exactly help matters. Poe's reputation was in tatters, but his wife suffered even more. People began sending her anonymous letters alleging her husband was having affairs. And by people, we almost certainly mean Elliot. Virginia was already frail, but the stress of the scandal eventually became too much. The end was near. Poe moved his wife to a small cottage in what is now the Bronx, hoping she could recover, but he could not save her. Virginia succumbed to tuberculosis at the cottage on January 30th, 1847. On her deathbed, she claimed that Mrs. E had been her murderer. Whatever Poe's relationship with Virginia was, her loss left him utterly inconsolable. He could not even bear to look at her face at her funeral, crying that he wanted only to remember her as she was. He regularly visited her grave for the rest of his life, even in the dead of winter. Friends would sometimes find him sitting next to her tomb, nearly frozen among the snowdrifts. Edgar Allan Poe was always an emotionally fragile man, but after Virginia was gone, Poe's life was disintegrating around him, and it brought him right back into the arms of his first love, Sarah Elmira Royster. It seemed like fate. They had missed each other in their youth, but here was a second chance. At first, it was as if Poe and Royster were teenagers again. They rekindled their relationship and quickly began discussing marriage. Her deceased husband's will stipulated that she would forfeit 3/4 of her inheritance if she remarried. Still, Poe disregarded the naysayers and asked for her hand. Royster needed some time to contemplate it, but by the time she was ready to give her answer, it was too late. The last time Sarah Royster ever saw Edgar Allan Poe, he looked like a specter. He came to her house shortly before departing for a trip to New York City, profoundly depressed and complaining of illness. Poe was a mere shell of his former self. His appearance worried Royster so much that she rushed to check on him the next morning, but he had already left. Edgar Allan Poe departed Richmond, bound for New York, on September 27, 1849. Nearly a week later, Joseph W. Walker discovered a tattered and delirious man in a gutter outside a tavern in Baltimore. That man was Poe, who had been missing the entire time. Walker pressed him for information. Poe could barely string together a sentence. The only coherent thing he managed to utter was a name, Dr. Joseph E. Snodgrass. Snodgrass was a friend who resided in Baltimore. Walker wrote to Snodgrass immediately, requesting assistance. When the man arrived, what he witnessed left him completely stunned. Snodgrass set about attempting to ascertain what had transpired, but as he questioned Poe, the mystery only deepened. Snodgrass could not elicit a single comprehensible word from Poe. The man had absolutely no recollection of what had happened to him, or perhaps he did not want to remember. When his doctor attempted to cheer him up by suggesting he would soon be back socializing with his friends, Poe grimly replied, "The best thing my friend could do would be to blow out my brains with a pistol." Poe did not speak much in those delirious days, but what he did say was utterly heartbreaking. He repeatedly called out for his wife back in Richmond. He never mentioned a name, which means one of two things. He mistook Sarah for Virginia and had forgotten his loss, or he meant Sarah, unaware that she had not yet accepted his marriage proposal. For whatever reason, the hospital refused to permit anyone to visit Poe in his final days. Every single piece of medical documentation regarding Edgar Allan Poe's final days, including his death certificate, has been lost. They may have never existed at all. What transpired with Poe in those grim moments, we may never know for sure. We have not even mentioned the most peculiar aspect of Edgar Allan Poe's twisted end. As he lay dying, he repeatedly shouted a single word, "Reynolds."